Hello, everybody. Welcome. Truly grateful to have this time together to learn and grow and explore and discover some of the confusingly obscured aspects of our nature, our origins as beings and organisms and animals and human beings, capable of the peculiarly dangerous behavior that I refer to as formal representational cognition. Most likely, though it's difficult to be sure without a direct experience of the interiority of other beings, which is accessible to human beings but is uncommon among us, particularly among moderns. It seems to have been common for our people throughout much of our history, according to the records that we have discovered and probably misinterpreted, but also according to existing indigenous peoples. I recall seeing a report from an ethnologist where, in conversation with an Australian indigenous man, the man began crying, the indigenous man, when he heard the ethnologist declare that no one can hear the stars. For the indigenous man could not imagine being human and not having this as part of one's common direct experience of being human. He didn't mean the noises the stars make. Clearly, what he meant was to hear the communication of the stars to humans. You know, when we live within, constantly, surrounded by cages and rectangles and frames, that naturally, by their nature, function, and structure, evict novelty and intelligence, communion, and remembering, then we are apt to become not merely blind, but to become self-blinding, because it turns out that for human cognition, as the perceptual aperture shrinks, so does the recognition that it is shrinking. And thus, what is evicted from our common experience, perception, participation, expectation, categorization, and so forth, eventually becomes most of what's going on, whatever that may be. And much of what's going on is intrinsically mysterious and unavailable to common representational templates, protocols. So we find ourselves in an ever-shrinking trap where our certitude that we know the facts is at once deceptively incomplete and peculiarly self-incompleting. it just keeps evicting more and more of our potential for relational eros and intimacy and wonder and awe and play. And the more that gets evicted, the more common and trenchant further deprivations become. This is detailed at great length in Ian McGilchrist's books, The Master and His Emissary, and his magnum opus, The Matter with Things. It seems that what we refer to as our left hemisphere, which usually points at the left cerebral cortex, which is a layer, a relatively thin layer, as I understand it, on the left side of our brains. This seems to be an experimental workshop, in a sense, for possible elaborations and specific elaborations of the potentials of the right hemisphere in those cases where most of the right hemisphere's way of being in the world is either severely limited or evicted. Peculiarly, we know from experiments in which the WADA test, in which it's no longer legal, but in which one of the cortexes could be anesthetized, that the left hemisphere manufactures fictions and clings to them with greater and greater severity the more they are questioned. We also know this from interviewing patients who've had strokes on the right hemisphere. And some of the reports from such patients are startling. When asked about their paralyzed left hand, they might reply, "That's not mine, it's yours. That's a piece of laundry that someone left here. That belongs to my mother. Tell her to come and get it." One patient reported that, "That's not my arm. It belongs to a tiny African man who lives under the bed." Another patient, startlingly, said that, "That's not my arm. It's a stock option." These patients could not, by any means, be convinced that their left arm actually belonged to their body. However, caloric vestibular stimulation, discovered, I think, in the late 1800s by an Italian neuroscientist. This is a procedure in which cold water is dribbled into the left ear canal while the patient lies on their right side so that that canal is pointing up. Can briefly reconnect the hemispheres, at which point the patients become aware of the situation and often become extremely emotional about the fact that they were clearly lying to the doctor. This implies that the right hemisphere is aware of the left hemisphere's estrangement from reality. Apparently, for the disconnected left hemisphere, and it can become quite disconnected for regular, ordinary persons. It's really just a matter of degree, right? My own experience is constantly subject to this. I believe something to be the case, and particularly if I feel offended, threatened, violated, not seen, mistreated, or otherwise placed in jeopardy. It's very surprising how quickly my awareness collapses from the entire field of possibilities to the one feature of my experience which I have decided to be the facts. Now, this is not to say that there are no facts, but rather that the facts that we derive from experience and experiment are not self-explanatory. None of them tell us what they mean. In order to interpret facts, we have to have something like the right hemispheres open, unusual, dreamlike, and deeply honest space, right? The space in which from which we experience understanding. Too commonly, the left hemispheres play in this complex mess of consciousness and cognition. Has nothing to do with understanding. What it claims to understand, it actually overstands. Right? It dominates. And it dominates from a place of fiction. Now, I have a couple of orienting purposes in today's talk. But for many years, decades in fact, I've been aware, both conceptually and experientially, that the human minds form a network. And that network is real, just as real as the physical world, but differently real. It includes all humans. It has both ordinary, i.e. physical, and non-ordinary infrastructure, connections, right, which I call the network the Cogniscium, and the connections I call the mimula. Most of the connectivity is non-ordinary, meaning there are no humans are not aware of this, have no language about it, concepts for it, generally speaking. And B, it's non-ordinary in the sense that physical connections are not required for information to be transmitted between and processed by humans, and groups of humans, and subgroups of humans, and so on. If someone wants to look for evidence, it's all over the place. But no one that I'm aware of, has proposed such a theory, therefore there's been no exploration of it. We might therefore reasonably state that there is no evidence for the existence of the Cogniscium. Of course, evidence is everywhere, but when nobody goes looking for it, then there is no evidence. Unfortunately, over the past 20 years, the human Cogniscium has been experiencing a series of shocking devastations that further limit the right hemisphere-like presence in that network and further magnify the left hemisphere-like aspects. And so there is a cataclysm occurring in the human Cogniscium which arises from a cascade of devastations over very short periods of human time. 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, and so forth, with the frequency of new devastations introduced into this manifold, rapidly, if not exponentially, increasing. This must not be unrelated to the machines we call large language models or artificial intelligence, because obviously any devices that are connected to human minds, or that human minds connect with or through, affect the structure, activity, and anatomy of the human cogniscium. And wherever they reinforce left hemispheric-like values, perspectives, priorities, then corresponding damage occurs not just in individual minds, but in the network of minds that connect all of us not merely to each other, but to all of nature. There are layers of the cognitia of the earth. There's the viral layer, the single cell layer, the bacterial layer, the vegetal layer, the insect layer, the invertebrate layer, right? There are all these layers. Tigers have their own cogniscium, but it's in intimate symbiosis with all of the others, so effects to the other cognitia are transferred via inheritance to each of the organs of the planet's cogniscium in this model or toy. What's truly dangerous about this is that as the assets we rely upon to understand and detect problems, threats, and opportunities, as those assets are damaged, or as they collapse into mere structural features, we will not know. Anything that affects what you make determinations with cannot be detected. In other words, anything that limits or changes your capacity for detection cannot itself be detected, so you will be unaware of it. You could wake up tomorrow as an entirely different person and you would not know that you had been someone else before.
Yeah, and you're literally just going to step over it. Try not to step on me. Step over it?
Now, the subject that I'm talking about gives us some degree of potential to understand our situation and to cope with it. But it gives us no immunity against anything that affects what we make determinations with. It's not clear that any such immunity is even possible, although if it were, it would come from liberating right hemisphere-like assets in waking consciousness, and possibly from any practice or situation that resulted in what we may refer to as enlightenment, which we must imagine places consciousness, grants, we might imagine that it grants a conscious being positions above, below, and outside of the cogniscium from which to safely interact with it without being determined by its qualities or characteristics in the moment. Dreaming is affected by the cogniscium, by the state, the current state, and the current local, personal, communal, and so forth connectivities that may or may not arise. But it is also partly outside the cogniscium. It's somewhat difficult for me to model this, but it is as if dreaming humans form a distinct body of knowledge, awareness, and even representations that the dreaming mind has access to, but the waking mind is mostly divorced from in most situations. So I have sensed directly and had direct experience of the catastrophic collapse of various features of the previously existing Cogniscium of humans. And these have occurred primarily in ways that are easily sensed and experienced over the past 20 years, but particularly in the last 10. The problem appears to be getting catastrophically worse over even short periods of time, as evinced by sleep and dreaming and metabolic problems in the humans that affect each person uniquely. Some are more immune than others, some are more vulnerable than others. The sequelae for any individual human, the consequences, can be radically different from another. One person can appear largely unaffected. A person right next to them can be effectively debilitated. This is the nature of how beings are. Categories are deceptive. They are generalizations over a manifold. Right? So, in the same way that every human who lives is born, their birth circumstances and childhood circumstances differ dramatically from each other. In some cases, they might as well be on different planets. Consider a child that grows up in staggering poverty, malnourished, perhaps physically mistreated, versus a child born to an extremely wealthy family where their every need and desire is immediately gratified. They're both human, they're both on the same planet. Their experience of what being human means might as well be two different things. And this is part of the next part of my talk today. So, categories are wildly deceptive. They're useful in a limited way as long as we remain aware of the scope of their reliability, which is usually vastly more minimal than anything we would be inclined to suppose. So it is my sense that the human cogniscium is now and has been undergoing a cascade of cataclysmic collapses in its diverse structure, and particularly in the aspects of its structure that are primarily inherited from human right hemispheric activity, concern, behavior, relationship, and so on. For the right hemisphere, relationship is everything. Names, concepts, tokenizations, quantities, and so forth are not meaningless, but they don't dominate evaluation. In fact, for the right hemisphere, evaluation is relation, whereas for the left hemisphere, evaluation is disembodied, abstract accounting. Now, those are gross simplifications, but they suffice to communicate the spirit of the situation. Now, getting back to problems with categories, we who live in boxes have no idea what we are or what the world is. If you were to go with a skillful indigenous person into the jungle, the shell of your habits might survive for a time, but as time wore on, your understanding of what you are, what the world is, what organisms are, what the forest is, what the lake is, what the mountain is, what the sky is, would undergo radical transformations. And this is not because you would become sort of This is not because you would become drunkenly indoctrinated by the superstitions of the indigenous person. Quite the opposite. The ridiculous suppositions that you have suffered with about your nature, what humans are, identity, machines, boxes, and so forth, would wear off. And suddenly aspects of your nature, origin, and interiority would become commonly present to your direct experience. You would probably have experiences of direct communication with other organisms, something modern humans consider to be impossible. And not just organisms, but living places. The mountain, the sky, the lake, the forest, the desert, the tundra. So we who live in boxes in modernity are bereft of nearly everything we are born to know, relate with, and become. And we are so habituated to this prison that anything that threatens it is likely to be attacked by us. Because after all, if we were to admit the novel transforming influence of our actual nature, this would naturally draw into question our entire history of behavior, and it would be found to have been not merely confused, but often, in many cases, vicious, stupid, wildly ignorant, arrogantly, grandiosely ignorant. One of the fingerprints of left hemispheric-like dismissal of the vast universe of faculties and natures that arise as human beings is the phrase, "There's no evidence of that." The stroke patient who is declaring that their left arm is not part of their body and belongs to a small African man who lives under their bed is in the grip of a wild fiction, but what's going on inside their mind is a complete refusal, a very complete, an absolute refusal to entertain the possibility that that limb on their left side is actually part of their body. So you can see that inside the mind of such a person, at least in the left hemisphere, which is still functioning after the stroke, there's no evidence that that arm belongs to me. And they will try to produce evidence that it doesn't. So this is quite astonishing. But it's an aspect of the trap we're in. The capacity for formal representational cognition is a profound potential that could become an astonishing array of gifts, but is so incredibly dangerous that what it becomes in any cohort of humans who are disconnected from each other and nature is a series of ever more devastating, if not apocalyptic, threats. So the potential for profound developmental efflorescence and so forth is there, but that's not what's going on if we take the trend over the curve, right? the possibility space of human behavior versus what actually gets mostly enacted, commonly enacted. Evil, whether or not evil beings exist, exists as the enaction of disembodied left hemispheric-like priorities. Counting the dollars, stacking them up in banks, and so forth. So the other night I'm going to switch topics here. The other night I was talking with my son. Same general direction, however. Categories, problem with categories. You know, I've spent a great deal of time in intimate contact with insects. I wouldn't call myself an entomologist. Perhaps I am entomophilic. Right? I adore all living beings, all living things. Though, like most humans, I have I have disaffinities. Right? I'm not a huge fan of ticks, for example. But I've had experiences with insects and arthropods that completely destroyed what the common humans think about them, how they think about them. And the thing I want to talk about is that along with having the wrong idea about what we are and what nature is and what the sky is, we have the wrong idea about what categories are. We don't know what trees are. We don't know what animals are. We don't know what humans are. But we also have this other concept that is interesting. Two concepts, actually. The first is angels. This is usually deployed as a pointer to a divine messenger being or enactor being, a being that enacts the will of the divine. No huge problems there, except that we think, most of us, that angels only exist in a kind of never-never land somewhere above physical space, right? And that's not entirely a problem either. Then we have this other word, gods. This is a much more complicated concept. Because gods and angels resemble each other, then we have the uniphore God, right, which refers to a single being from which everything apparently, conceptually anyway, is born or originates or is created by. So we have these concepts, right? But in my experience of interacting with animals and insects, fishes and reptiles, it's clear to me that divine beings incarnate. And that means that some of those snakes aren't snakes. Some of those trees are not trees. Some of those raccoons are not raccoons. Some of those humans are not humans. You can encounter a human so astonishing and so catastrophically generative of immediate transformation in your awareness, perception, ideation, lexicons, and so forth, that it is impossible to determine what category it belongs to. I have encountered a number of humans like this. Perhaps to some degree I am one. a tiger or lion is obviously a god. It transcends everything about the box cultures and common suppositions. It doesn't give a shit what you think or believe. As a friend, it might as well be like having an angel with you. As an enemy, it might as well be like encountering a demon. Now, it's my experience that all living things have this quality of being vessels whose interiority encompasses the divine. In other words, organisms are a bit like the opposite of UFOs. They are the portion, they are a vehicle in material existence for the interiorization and participation of divine beings. And what I mean by divine so far is simply transcendental to the merely physical. I also mean nonordinary. Now, I have encountered insects that were capable of direct telepathic communication with my mind. Animals, living places, trees, and so forth. It's not extremely common, although its commonality increases as I reduce the degree of strangeness required to qualify for non-ordinary. So, for example, last night, a moth entered my house, and it was a large moth, and there was some concern on my part about its well-being. It was disoriented by the bright lights and such. We had a number of physical interactions. At first, the moth responded to me primarily as either a threat or an unknown thing. But over a short period of time, through contact with my mind and body, the moth became intelligently aware that it was disoriented, that it was in danger, and that I was trying to assist it. At that point, it calmed down, climbed onto an object I presented to it, remained on that object while I took it past a number of bright lights, and when I got it outside after a period of adjustment, it climbed onto my finger. We had a moment of relational intimacy together. The moth signaled to me that it was grateful, in my view, and then finally departed. I've had hundreds of experiences like this. It doesn't mean I'm special. I am special in the sense that I acknowledge the beingness and completeness of the interiority of living organisms. And in my essay, Organisms are a platform for the, I can't remember the language I used. Organisms are a platform, yeah, I can't remember, it's funny, for the participation of transcendental beings in the physical layer of reality. I talk about this at length. It's on my Medium page, organelle.medium.com. And this has become more and more a part of my common experience and awareness, particularly since I met Amber, a young woman who was paralyzed in a car accident from the chest down last November. Amber Bourne. During our conversations, I experienced cascades of insights related to this. And I think we have existence entirely inside out and backwards. The idea of worship, while not something I want to dismiss entirely, is backwards, because we are a platform for the participation with the transcendental in the physical layer, and all organisms are thus, regardless of their seemingly small or insignificant size or lifespan. In fact, it may well be that the smaller the organism and the shorter its lifespan, the more intense this property becomes. There's no reason to suspect otherwise yet. However, even in relating with humans, you can meet humans who were Joe yesterday and are an angel today. The expected and proposed continuity of personal identity is nonsensical and is primarily a result of being trapped in contexts so limiting, confusing, so filled with relational and participatory deprivation that the personal identity becomes the only thing apparent to the person thus entrapped. And this naturally leads to grandiosity and egoism, arrogance, and so forth. So what I'm trying to get at is that I think the organisms are gods. They are angels, every one of them. To differing degrees in different times, you can encounter a dog that is just like a human, mostly concerned with its personal identity. You can also encounter a dog that will immediately give its life to protect you or to heal you in a non-ordinary way. Modern humans don't believe that dogs have any inherent capacity to heal humans. Those moderns are so confused that they have mistaken a matchstick for the sun. Or rather the other way around. They've mistaken the sun for a matchstick. There isn't anything but divine beings. The physical layer is profoundly deceptive, and nothing is more deceptive about this than human cognition, at least in moderns, the formal representational stuff I was talking about earlier. So I hope that you, the listener, will receive my words as an invitation to both escape the trap and to resist the urge to continue collapsing the manifold of your nature, origin, being, and faculties into conceptual representations. This is something we need each other's help with. I had transcendental assistance in this matter, for which I am profoundly grateful. But I have faced many catastrophic and dangerous and painful challenges in the aftermath of that experience because, like you, I live in the representational layer of common human behavior, thought, activity, judgment, and so forth. Our children are born free of this, though they may carry some traces of it and a propensity for uptake of representational cognition. But when they are new, it's blatantly obvious. If you simply just look in their eyes, you will see that they are infinite, they are divine, they are transcendental. Unless you reject these concepts as not matching your experience or the evidence that you've been presented with, in which case you will just think, it's just a human infant, no big deal. Though very few parents are capable of that degree of dismissal, at least in the beginning. I am still in the process of processing what I've experienced. And I can find both kinds of other people. People who will just dismiss this out of hand, rationalists and skeptics. But if you look back to the beginning of the discussion, it's obvious that if you establish and sustain a structure that defends you from insight and novelty and exploration, then that structure will recursively tighten the aperture until what you're capable of entertaining is basically nothing but dead language and concepts. There are sort of two kinds of ignorance in this way. I mean, there are myriads of kinds, but two that I'm concerned with here. The first is the ignorance of not knowing, but the second is the ignorance of the habitual rejection of anything that would transform the trap. And this is the common position of skeptics. They think of themselves as, quote, evidence-based, unquote. But again, there will be no evidence for anything you don't go looking for. And the fact that you might find or locate some prosaic explanation for some phenomena does not mean that the phenomena is equivalent to your explanation. In fact, there are no phenomena that are equivalent to an explanation. None. Zero. When I was maybe I was 7 or 8, we had in our backyard in Stockton an enormous orb weaver spider, and my memory may exaggerate things slightly. That does happen, and I misremember things as well. I'm human, but I remember that spider's spread as being about the size of my face or larger at that age. And she was golden and black and orange and was, in every reasonable aspect of my experience of her, a god. I used to catch these large moths in the grass in our small backyard lawn, and I would hold them up near her web, and she would climb down on my hand to retrieve them, and we would have a moment of intimacy in that sense, and then she would return to her web. We were very close friends. My parents marveled at this, but I had many spider friends when I was young. I still have some today, though nothing as glorious as her. I'm not sure if this is apparent, but most of the spiders that you will see in webs are females. It's not that necessarily that males don't make webs, it's that they're far less noticeable, and some males don't do much web making. Some of them are kleptoparasites, so they find webs of females and study the females by orbiting the web and stealing some of the food that may be captured by the web. And I can hear in my own mind an objection to the story I told about the spider. What about the moths? Why were you feeding the moths to the spider? Aren't they gods too? They are. But I was oriented by the unimaginable sophistication and charisma of the spider. And that orientation, I'm not sure I would do the same thing today. It's very difficult for me to feed an animal to another animal emotionally. There are also creatures who distribute the divine, the transcendental, over populations. And then what you will see, for example, bees and humans, then what you will see is, occasionally you'll run into a human For example, a ballerina, a surgeon, a professor of philosophy, a painter, a dancer, sometimes a biologist. You can discover humans who have radically escaped the definition space of their ordinary humanity and are, in a sense, either angels or gods compared to the other humans. If comparison is your goal, you will see that there are humans who have ascended so far beyond the lowlands of their humanity, so to speak, that they are no longer merely human. And we call them stars in English. Never for a moment thinking about this connection, or even that stars might be beings, transcendental beings, beings so transcendental that they produce the minds with which we evaluate them as a side effect of their common activity and an organ of their nature. But this is how I generally conceive of the physical layer. I mean, without the sun, there'd be no language, no math, no art, no science, no religion, no arguments, no one to argue. So the very mind with which we dismiss the transcendental nature of the sun is produced by that star, moment to moment, instant to instant. I'm so grateful to have this time together to learn and explore and grow and widen the aperture of our access to what it can mean to be human and to what we can become, especially together. Take a moment, if you will, and like or subscribe. Poke the algorithm if you care to. I'd appreciate it. If you want to make a little donation or a large donation or support my work, there are links in my YouTube About section where you can make a one-time donation, buy me a coffee, sign up for Patreon, or just leave a comment or question. And if you do that, I will certainly respond. I wish you every kind of beautiful healing and relational joy, amazing dreams, deep, abiding friendships, and the recognition of your nature as much more than merely a human being. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.